I couldn't resist the opportunity to talk a little bit about an article that was published quite a few years ago now. This article has meant so much to me as I've developed as a researcher in my identity as a teacher educator. And that's Pamela Hartman's 2006 Research in the Teaching of English article, Loud on the Inside. Working Class Girls, Gender and Literacy. So before I go any further with the slides, I just wanted to introduce Dr. Hartman because she's here. So just kind of zooming in. Okay, so I actually didn't, collaborate with Pam at all on this work. This is just sort of from my heart and talking about a little bit about my own journey as a teacher and a researcher, and how this article factors into my ever-evolving thinking about literacy and gender. And I think it's a really important article, and I think sometimes in our field we tend to forget about the important works, and we tend to really focus on the juicy, sexy issues of the day, right? So in the year 2013, what's on all of our minds right now? Everybody's obviously talking about the Common Core standards. There are a lot of things that are buzzing around in the air at this conference that a lot of people are talking about, and we tend to forget that there are significant pieces of research and theory that support them that have sort of shaped our thinking and shaped our theory and shaped our practice. And it's important to continue those conversations and not let those conversations simply stop. So we read an article that really shapes who we are and shapes our identity, and then we move on and don't really do much with it 5 years later. I think it's important to keep those conversations going. So to give you a sense of the work so that you'll sort of have a context for the theory and the research that I'm talking about. Okay, so it's a Mac, and I don't know how to use Mac, so what do we do? Oh, I need to do like a...
There's like arrows on the keyboard. You can just hit the arrow.
Oh, the arrow?
Yeah, Macs have arrows.
Okay, so that's the abstract from Pamela's article. And I'm actually going to go ahead and read it because it's important to understand what the article is about to really contextualize where I'm going to go with this talk. So, drawing on data gathered during a 7-month study of the literacy practices of a group of white working class girls who have successfully navigated their high school's English curriculum, this ethnography investigates 1, how gender and class influence the girls' uses of literacy in the classroom, and 2, how the girls use text from English class to construct gender. The study is grounded in constructivist and feminist theory to understand literacy events. Findings suggest that these working class girls used literature in the English classroom to get ahead, which meant developing a discourse of a good student, which included hard work, goal orientation, participation, and silence in order to succeed. This strategy often came at the expense of engaging with the texts and expressing opinions. As a result, the girls frequently did not take up literature in school in ways that contributed to a critical understanding of gendered roles in society and the ways these roles might serve to empower or restrict them as women. The girls had begun to recognize and regret this loss of voice, but felt that it was in their best academic interest as a good student to remain silent. So this article is important to me because as a first-generation college student, I could identify with many of the participants in the article and the quotes that they shared. And as I've moved through the stages of academia, up through teaching certification, master's degree, PhD, and becoming a teacher educator, there are times when I have still felt silenced and still felt like in order to be accepted in the academy, there are certain rules that you have to play by. So it always spoke to me in a powerful way. But it became even more important in my practice when I started about 5 years ago teaching a graduate course called Research in the Teaching of English. actually, there's one student, there's one student in the room who's currently in that course. So I teach that course every fall. So once a year, I'm trying to show graduate students who are mostly practicing English teachers the value of engaging in action research or ethnographic research, meaningful inquiry into issues in English education. And what always comes up over and over is that articles, particularly the kind of articles we find in RTE, Research in the Teaching of English, or AERJ, American Educational Research Journal, are filled with lots of jargon. They can be very off-putting in terms of the ways in which the ideas are presented. And teachers, practicing teachers, they feel left out of the dialogue oftentimes. They feel that there is a real disconnect between the kind of work that we do in educational research and the kind of work that they want to explore as consumers of research. They want to read about teaching and learning. They want to know more. But they want to see themselves in it. They want to hear their ideas reflected in the teachers. They want to see themselves in the students. They want connection. And over, year after year, I've had success with Pamela's article. And every time I see her at Ncte, I run up to her and I say, I just taught your article and it was just as amazing as last year. Because they get tired of a lot of the jargon. And one thing that they praise about the articles, and it's very, very well written and very accessible, it's sort of a bridge from teaching to research. And I want to guide them across that bridge because ultimately the field depends upon it. All of this talk about Common Core standards and evaluation of teachers and constant assessment, and there's so much coming down on teachers from above. If we don't position them as intelligent, powerful, empowered thinkers in the field of English education, they'll just get swept up and washed away with the tide. And educational research can do that for them if they're welcomed into that discourse. So there are a couple things about the article that do this particularly well. The first thing is that Pamela uses really great quotes from students. Quotes that my students see themselves in, just as I saw myself in. So we know that lots and lots of teachers, people who go on to be English teachers, are women. Many of them are white, many of them are working class, okay? That's not to say that all teachers are, and at Buffalo State, unlike the institution where I got my certification, and I know some of you are here from that institution as well, I teach in a much more diverse program than the one I was certified in. So we teach many students of color, and so we explore lots of issues of race and identity and ethnicity. But gender is something that often gets brushed aside, as Dr. Sircone said. And so, as I said, the quotes jump off the page. The ideas are things that the students can relate to, and so many of my students, semester after semester, say, I see myself in these girls. And so the title of the article comes from this quote from one of Pamela's participants. I'm kind of quiet because I don't always stand up for myself, I guess. Like, I don't always voice my opinion all the time. Some people think I'm quiet, but I'm really loud on the inside. Such a powerful quote. So a couple of years ago, okay, let's talk about this one first. So the other thing that I find so useful about Pamela's work is that if we're going to take a feminist approach to educational research, we have to position ourselves within the story. We have to account for our own biases. We have to account for our own story. Pamela does this quite nicely when she articulates her researcher's stance. She says, I kept a journal of my personal reflections as I gathered and analyzed the data. It was in this journal that I reflected on my own background as a working class student who had to make the transition to a middle class lifestyle, and school in which I was an outsider. Even as a 9-year-old, although I was not aware of the complexity of the situation, I knew at some level that I did school differently than the middle class kids. As a young adult, I thought of these differences as individual rather than social. It was not until later, partially through this study, that I came to realize that social issues such as class, gender, and gender greatly affect our literacy uses, and that literacy events such as the ones that I encountered in this study affect the ways we view ourselves. So once again, the power of infusing her own voice and her own story into the research is very compelling to my students, particularly students who, like me, first-generation college students, many of them do identify as working class. But the other thing that's so powerful about this article that is so often left out of research reports is the way that Hartman acknowledges her own researcher stance. So as qualitative researchers, we're always striving for trustworthiness, triangulation, transferability. Well, the trustworthiness is all right there. We hear her voice, we hear her story, and we know the lens through which she was viewing the research site and subsequently analyzing the data. And that's really powerful. It gives us information and insight into the story she's telling in a way that helps us to believe it and helps us to make sense of it for ourselves. So this is a quote that I actually saved from a reflection that a student wrote for me about 4 years ago when I taught this course. And I kept it because she was a really important student to me. She was going through a really tough time at the school she was teaching at and ultimately left the school where she was teaching because she felt so unsupported by administration. The story has a happy ending because she's now teaching at another school. She's teaching a very diverse group of students in an area of the city that is lacking a lot of funding and resources and doing wonderful things with her students, and is very, very fulfilled. And I always knew that this teacher was going to do something special. But the reflection that she wrote to this article was always very compelling and powerful to me, and so I've kept it sort of with important things that I might write about someday. But I have kept in touch with her, and as I said, she's doing very well. But at the time, she said something really powerful to me. After reading Pamela Hartman's article, she said, I could have been one of the girls in this article. I was loud on the inside, white, working class, good student, good girl. In some ways, I still am. I don't speak up as much in my English courses. With some professors, it's like, I haven't read all the critics. I don't have all the answers. Just tell me what to say. I teach in a department that is somewhat unusual in that when students go through our master's program to get an MS in English education, they have to take up to 5 English literature content courses. So quite often they're taking a course on Faulkner or a course on literary theory at the graduate level, or things that can complement the kinds of explorations we're doing in English education in important ways. But sometimes they don't. And sometimes it's difficult. And sometimes students feel like outsiders in some of those discussions, particularly teachers who are out in the trenches every day working hard. They drag themselves to class at the end of the day and sit down, and the MA students, who they're in the same classes with, who are getting their degrees in English, have a very different discourse than the students who are there primarily to focus on pedagogy. And sometimes there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance. And so what was important for this student was to recognize the ways in which, we talk about this a lot in my courses, it's important to recognize the ways in which we simultaneously inhabit privileged spaces and subordinated spaces, right? So as a white female who in some ways is experiencing a lot of privilege, getting an education, having a full-time job, she's experiencing this sense of marginalization or oppression when she's outside of the dominant discourse. And getting students to connect with that idea, to understand that sometimes we occupy privileged spaces and sometimes we occupy subordinated spaces, is critically important in developing an ethic of care among beginning teachers, and understanding that that holds true for their students as well. So many of my students identify with the kids in Pamela Hartman's article. But what's also interesting is that teaching this article does not come without controversy, because ultimately some students identify with the teacher. And so every couple of semesters, someone raises their hand and says, you know, I get where she's coming from with this, but I'm a teacher. I do my best every day, and sometimes I don't call on the girls because it's just too hard, and they don't want to talk, and the boys always want to talk. And I get what she's saying, but didn't she kind of throw Heidi under the bus? Right? I'm sorry. You'll get a chance to respond.
Oh, Heidi, I love it. She didn't lie. She talked.
So this is particularly important to me because this gets at the heart of questions around ethics in qualitative research. So my dissertation research, as some of you know, was a very complicated story. And I published one very happy story that came out of my dissertation research in Voices from the Middle. And I published a very complicated, problematic, nuanced, difficult story in a book called Literacies, the Arts and Multimodality that was published by Peggy Albers and Jen Sanders. And I had to separate them into two different publications because they're two very, very different stories. Because ultimately, in one day, a teacher can make some really, really good decisions and some really bad ones, right? So it's messy. Qualitative research is messy. When I first began my journey as a qualitative research, I tried to align myself with theories on research that were grounded in a feminist approach. So I relied heavily on the work of Winders, who stated that ethical goals should be informed above all else by a caring attitude towards others. So I thought, okay, great, I care. I got that one down. Caring in research honors the trust on which the researcher's access to information is predicated and out of which develops a sense of collaborative labor. From this perspective, collaboration is a more apt term than reciprocity because collaborative relations denote a shared affinity as well as interdependence. I was a teacher's aide in the classroom. The teacher and I were collaborators, and I let the students use my own equipment that was purchased with my own resources, not from a grant or anything that I had received. I was trying to aim for real reciprocity. And this presentation isn't about my own research, but I'm offering this anecdote because it factors in, it matters. The researcher should remain present, attentive, and fully engaged as a co-member of the participant's immediate community. Pamela Hartman was in her research site for 7 months. I was in my research site for a year. I thought that by doing these things, all that messy ethical stuff would go away. It doesn't. It doesn't go away. It doesn't go away. And ultimately, Pamela was presented with a situation that she had to write about. And I was presented with the situation that I had to write about because what I decided, and what I'm assuming that Pamela decided, but although I hadn't spoken to her about it, I look forward to hearing her response after the talk, is that ultimately questions of social justice and issues of equity matter. And while the teacher's perspective was enormously valuable to my research, I had to tell the student stories and allow their voices to speak as well. So I tried to do what Pamela did and contextualize it, write about the teacher with a great deal of respect and nuance and thoughtfulness, but ultimately, if educational research is going to serve as a vehicle for social justice, sometimes we have to make difficult choices. So there's some researchers and thinkers in our field who are now wrestling with some of these difficult questions. A chapter in Change Matters, Critical Essays on Moving Social Justice Research from Theory to Policy by S.J. Miller and David Kirkland got me thinking about some of these issues more recently. And actually several chapters got me thinking about them, but Janet Alsop's chapter, if you're familiar with Janet Alsop's work, I know it's very important to her field. I know it's very important to Dr. Sircone's work, teacher identity. She explores a lot of really important issues. Dr. Alsop's work led me to this book by Leslie Rebecca Bloom from 1998, Under the Sign of Hope, Feminist Methodology and Narrative Interpretation. And I think it's important to remember that research, the kind of research that we do, research on human beings, on stories, on literacy events, is complicated and messy. And it's not just black and white. And I thought that this quote really kind of speaks to the complexities effectively. Feminist methodology is as non-unitary. This is kind of a new thinking for me, this non-unitary thing. It's really moving my work in new directions, as is human subjectivity. Feminist methodology resists normalization and attempts to falsely stabilize it. It is created through situated relationships and social contexts. It is internally conflicted as a sometimes conformist and sometimes subversive practice. It fragments with conflict. It is rife with shifting positions of power. It demands the freedom of mobility, and it is continually being constructed in language and discourse. Feminist methodology, like women's non-unitary subjectivity, is a means through which we may reinterpret the world, others, ourselves, and our lived experiences. As a non-unitary concept and practice, feminist methodology resists definition, since it must be understood as tentative, residing to a great extent in the idiosyncratic, subjective practices and beliefs of the person doing the research and interpretation. So there are a lot of conflicting ideas rolled up in one really juicy quote there. And what drew me to that quote, as I said, was Janet Alsop's work. So I think I'm going to share just a little bit of Janet Alsop's thinking to kind of bring the quote into sharper relief and to kind of contextualize the ideas a little bit. So Alsop writes about this particular work and how it's influenced her own thinking as a researcher, both in 2004 and more recently in that publication, which was 2010. This is from 2004, Janet Alsop. I think we often have viewed ourselves as having singular subjectivities, that is, female, working class, academic, white, and as such in either a collaborative or oppositional relationship to the subjects under study, including personal narratives or self-reflective accounts in a research text, can be more effective and useful if the researcher is aware of the concept of non-unitary subjectivity and tells her story with this in mind. In other words, I seek to expand Bloom's concept of non-unitary subjectivity by arguing that it should work reciprocally between the researcher and the researched, and between the researcher and the audience for which her research is intended. So she's complicating this notion of, in order to be an ethical qualitative researcher, I'm the helper in the classroom, I'm studying you, but I'm not going to write anything bad about you, and we're all in this together. it's a little more complicated than that if we are really going to push the field forward and continuing to wrestle with these ideas of how to maintain reciprocity, how to maintain ethical care of our research participants, but ultimately how to tell the appropriate story that needs to be told from the data. That's what really matters, and that's what we should continue to grapple with. S.J. Miller and David Kirkland talk about the importance of social justice in Change Matters. Really important book. Critical essays on moving social justice research from theory to policy. And ultimately, as I've wrestled with these ideas throughout my career as a researcher, these ideas of, is it okay to throw someone under the bus? Well, no, it never is. And we always need to write about our research participants with respect and with great nuance and thoughtfulness. Ultimately, though, it is important to aim for social justice and to keep the end goal in mind of improving our field and improving the lives of students. So I found this quote both particularly inspiring but also grounding in terms of my research identity. We ground this work in the belief that English teaching, English teacher preparation, and language and literacy research and policies are political activities that mediate relationships of power and privilege in social interactions, institutions, and meaning-making processes. Such relationships, we believe, have direct implications for how we achieve equity and access in English classrooms. We feel it is impossible to prepare English teachers to engage in serious inquiry in the English education field without first meeting these goals. Hence, we see the challenge of English education research and practice as sustaining the critical dialogue necessary for developing and uncovering theories and practices in the teaching of English that foreground and promote respect across multiple social categories, including race, gender, gender expression, sexual orientation, ethnicity, language, national origin, spiritual belief, class, socioeconomic status, and size. And they're citing there the Conference on English Education Commission on Social Justice, 2009. So I asked my research class last week, with all of these things in mind, and most of them are practicing current teachers who, if not in their own classrooms, are long-term subs. How would you feel about having a researcher in your classroom? Okay, so the first quote is from one of my favorite students of all time, and I've only just met this guy like 2 months ago, and everything he says is just so. You know exactly what I'm talking about. You know who I'm talking about. He every day he goes into this oppressive situation where the principal marches into his classroom and tells all the kids to spit out their gum and pay attention and slaps the desk and tells him everything he's doing wrong as a teacher. And then the principal leaves and he's got to pick up all the pieces and pull it all back together and get all the kids back on board with his state-approved lesson plan. And he's still got that fire, he's still got that spark, but he's brutally honest. And he said, I would hate every second of that experience. Every second. Another student said, I never think I'm doing a good enough job. Went on to say, I would feel even more self-conscious with a researcher in the classroom. We went round and round, and finally another student said, you know, if I truly believed that the research would help kids. So that is where we are. That is what we're up against. It is a difficult time in which to be an English teacher. And we need to keep these things in mind when looking for participants for a research study, when talking with our students, when preparing English teachers. And ultimately, everyone is kind of somewhere on this spectrum right now. Everybody's kind of somewhere on that spectrum. So we have a lot of thinking to do about how do we support each other, whether we're student teachers, whether we're beginning teachers, whether we're mentor or veteran teachers or teacher educators, how do we support each other as partners on this journey? I think that this quote kind of grounds us. If I truly believe that the research would really help kids, ultimately, I hope that Heidi, who is a wonderful teacher in Pamela's research, but ultimately is trying to create a safe space for her students and therefore not pushing the young working class women to give voice to their subjectivities. Ultimately, I would hope that Heidi and the participant in my research, who I wrote a particularly complicated article about, would agree that the goal is to improve teaching and learning for all kids. Using Pamela's article as inspiration, I had my students write a short piece about their identity as researchers. And I tell them about my own identity, about being a first-generation college student and how that's affected my identity as a teacher and a researcher. I had my students do the same thing. And this is what one young woman wrote. And this was right after reading Pamela's article. I am a researcher now because I want to be. Oh, I am a researcher. This is the first time I've ever written that sentence. I really liked that. I am a researcher now because I want to be, but also because my future students need me to be. There are students that I will teach who have never had a positive experience with school in their recollection. I will have students who deal drugs, are sexually active, support their families, have been in wars, suffer from depression, can't speak English, own guns, are wards of the state. The list goes on in perpetuity. This means that I need to be as different as they are in my approach to guiding them. To be different, I must explore the ways in which I can be different, ways that will be effective, ways that will create educational equity. There's a lot of messy stuff in there. It sounds like she might be generalizing or othering students in some ways, which is important to be mindful of. But the reality is that Buffalo is one of the most segregated cities in the country, and it's, I believe, the second or third poorest. So these are not necessarily sweeping generalizations, although they are a little messy. And I think it's in the messiness that we find hope and that we find meaning. Because Pamela reminds us, encouraging our students to engage in conversations about social and economic inequity requires a certain amount of discomfort. Only through this discomfort can the complexity of social difference be uncovered. We have to be comfortable with the discomfort. We have to be comfortable in that space. So thank you, Pamela, for all of the inspiration that your work has given me. And that's all. Okay, I'm gonna go for it. Are we ready? I think it's really, I was almost getting a little teary when I was listening to Dr. Castello because I feel like I was that girl too. I'm first generation college student. I'm kind of 1 foot in. I'm a high school teacher. I'm on sabbatical right now, and I'm working on my doctorate. And I'll be the first PhD in my family. And my father is kind of like the person who's always like, you can do this. And it's almost more because it was kind of like a groundbreaking sort of thing for my family. So I think personally that was great for me to hear. I'm going to talk, I think, in ways that are very similar. I'm going to talk about messiness and complexity and challenge and discomfort. And it's grounded mostly in this experience I had last year in one of my classes. I teach at a first-ring suburban high school in Western New York, and the research project that I did for a microethnography class at the University of Buffalo was based on my 11th grade English class, and it was one of those classes in my 10 years of teaching that kind of, I think, I'll be like 90 years old and still trying to figure it out.
There are students that meant a lot to me, still are enigmas to me. I felt like it was extremely challenging, but also really fulfilling. And I'm working through kind of reflecting on that class, so this presentation is kind of where my thinking's at right now. And kind of what really started this project was I thought a lot about social justice issues, and I kind of identified myself as a teacher and a researcher through social justice. But what I always felt like was that social justice was kind of over here, and then academic literacy and academic work is over here. And the two worlds never seem that intertwined. So for me, I kind of always thought about, in my earlier career, doing things with social justice in mind, but I never looped them to my everyday kind of experiences working with English students working on skill-based things. And this project, I think, kind of working through this, has helped me realize that our identities as teachers, as students, are so entwined in the learning experience, and creating a space for critical literacy not only promotes social justice and questioning and thinking, it promotes really rigorous, deep academic thinking. And I think the two are really one and the same, and I think we need to, as a collective educational family, kind of work on bringing them together, that they're not, I feel like sometimes social justice is othered as this other thing, when I think it's really centrally located to academic learning. The class that I'm focusing on is a co-taught classroom. The quote up there is from one of my students from last year, who said over and over, "Who'd you piss off to get us this year? Like, what did you do?" And they kind of, my class identified itself as like, we're the like terrors. We're the group that you must be decent because they gave you our class. And they were kind of like determined. That identity was like started from day one. Like, we're kind of, we're the badasses of this group. And it's going to be, you know, this is going to be tough. And I thought a lot about where that came from. And I felt like co-taught English classrooms where there are special education students with IEP needs, I felt like those classes that I had taught in the past were always sort of positioned not in the same way that my other English classes were. And I found that this class in particular really identified themselves outside of what would be considered a traditional academic classroom. And I thought that it's extremely, as I went into this year, I wanted to reframe the co-taught classroom through critical literacy inquiry, because I thought often myself and other teachers are encouraged to go more rote-based, skill-based pedagogy when you're teaching inclusive classes. I think often that high academic literacy people often associate with more honors-type classes. And I even had an interaction with someone working at my school said, you know, with those kids, you're really going to have to do this kind of thing. You're going to have to keep it simple. And I did not want to do that, and I think the kids were very accustomed to that kind of learning. I also saw this as a space where I was going to be working with students horizontally together as a learning community. I wanted to kind of break down that notion of I'm the teacher and you're the students. In terms of framing this theoretically, the work of Paulo Freire, the pedagogy of the press, has always been kind of a grounding theory for me, talking about problem-posing education, the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality. My students did not talk about school this way at all. It was kind of more about getting through. And I think that comment at the beginning of the year, the "who'd you piss off," kind of embodies that in a lot of ways. The other framework that for me has been very influential is Patrick Finn's Literacy with an Attitude. This domesticating literacy versus empowering literacy. And for me, when I think about this a lot, working in a working class school, but I think for me in this year, in this project that I'm talking about, it wasn't just working with working class students. I felt that it was working in that co-taught inclusion classroom. There was a domesticating type of literacy that kind of was almost positioned when you're teaching inclusion. And I think that I cognizantly wanted to fight against that and move towards a more empowering literacy. And how to do that, I think, was something that I was trying to figure out. The other piece that sort of framed this project for me, and I'm still thinking about it, was the work of Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks is kind of a personal favorite. And her work in talking about engaged pedagogy has been really helpful to me in thinking about this project and other projects. Progressive, holistic education, engaged pedagogy is more demanding than conventional, critical, or feminist literacy. For unlike these two teaching practices, it emphasizes well-being. That means that teachers must be actively involved, committed to a process of self-actualization that promotes their own well-being if they are to teach in a manner that empowers students. I think also we have to think about the teacher identity and what do we bring into our classrooms? How do our experiences, how do our paradigms, how does that shape what we're doing as teachers as well as researchers? And I think reading this and thinking about it has helped frame it. And I think taking the teacher identity and privileging it as important as the student identity is really integral to this. This is my classroom. And just to kind of give you a little bit about the specific class I'm talking about, it's a co-taught classroom. The special education teacher I worked with was the exact same age. She's an African-American woman. We both are mothers. We both have taught in the school for about the same amount of time, about 8 years. And we have a similar pedagogical approach. It was the first time I ever was in a co-taught classroom with a special education teacher that I felt like we were on the same page. We had 22 students, 13 had IEPs. That's a very high number of students with IEPs. 10 of the students in the class were on free and reduced lunch. 40% of the students in the class were attending half-day tech programs. And there was that subtlety of tracking in this class that from pretty much 9th grade, these kids, this group, they were on the track to definitely go into vocational classes. Some of my students were extremely excited about it. Other students seemed to kind of be there because they didn't really do that well in school often. It was an extremely diverse classroom in race, socioeconomics, culture, time in the district. Some students had grown up in the district, other students were coming in just that year. The way I set up this classroom, I'm thinking about inquiry, thinking about critical literacy. I set it up as a year-long inquiry into students' lives, cultures, community, and popular culture through engagement with text, discussion, composition, and creation. But for me, this particular year, last year, was full of tensions, and I think when Dr. Bissell talks about the complexities, this wasn't like perfection, inquiry, it's awesome year. This was probably one of the hardest teaching years of my life. In terms of the school, and I know all of you know what this is like, it was the first year of APPR. The Common Core Learning Standards were being implemented. There were recommended texts that I was being asked, strongly suggested to teach. Many students were very disconnected from reading and writing. And this class in particular positioned themselves outside of traditional academic literacies. So that was a really challenging dynamic at play. And I think there was a part of me inside that head, even with 10 years in and some work in graduate school, thinking, do I need to go more skill-based? Do I need to go more? I mean, even there is that voice in my head, and I can imagine people who might not even have had as much experience in the classroom, how that dynamic is at play. And I want to be very honest about that. The large thematic questions overarching English 11 are right here. How do my experiences in life impact my choices? In what ways does my identity shape my understanding of the world? In what ways do I want to shape or change my community? What drives our hopes and dreams in life? In what ways do our dreams help us or hold us back? Those are the questions that I used to plan the entire year. That was really how English 11 was structured. And I wanted to keep them large enough so that students could bring in what they were interested in. And I also wanted to keep them rooted in the community. The community that I teach in is extremely interesting and important, and the context of the school plays into the everyday experiences at the school. I'm going to talk about two kind of the bigger literacy events that I focused on throughout the year. And the title of my presentation, and kind of what I felt was a game-changing moment, came from the fall semester. And I said started because part of me in the past had thought about critical literacy and went right in there thinking about how do you feel about race? How do you feel about gender? How do you feel about socioeconomics? Let's talk about it. Let's do this. And I felt when you do that, kind of as what I've learned, it's like really overwhelming to kids, and sometimes you get these like gut reactions. And so my planning has kind of changed throughout the years. And I'm starting to kind of open up with some of the larger questions and let the students kind of guide me. And that's taken some time to figure out. For this year, our fall quarter, we talked about looking at our life histories and our families. What I found through that work, students were dying to talk about race and socioeconomics in their lives. And that was something that I think came out through a mix of our classroom discussions and the text that we were reading. A particular moment where this quote's from, we were talking about a raisin in the sun in the neighborhoods, and a raisin in the sun. And where I work, there's a lot of talk in neighborhoods, and what each neighborhood represents, and how they relate to the city that we live in, and kind of how they relate to, if you grew up here, this is who you are, and you don't understand me if you grew up here. And what I found also is that my students, a lot of them were athletes and were traveling to different school districts for sports, and they were noticing how they were getting treated in different ways, in different places, and how different schools looked very different than their school, or felt very different. And one of my students, as we talked about how Walter was treated by George Murchison in Raisin in the Sun, one of my students was talking about how he felt on a football team going to a rural school in the area and getting called racial epithets and a bunch of other things, and how people would look at them and treat them. And one of the other students said, in this recording I have, is that oppression on the down low? And I remember thinking, that's pretty amazing to point out. We talked a lot and explored about what does it mean to have oppression on the down low versus overt oppression, and what does that look like in this story? What does it look like in our lives? And I found that they were kind of craving to talk about it. And again, I had to think a lot. What I found happening too as teachers, my co-teacher and I, kind of our life experiences were emerged into it. I remember feeling uncomfortable a little bit talking about it. But I could tell that was sort of this driving need. There was a driving need to really kind of make sense of it. The other part of the core text that we looked at as well were Mice and Men, Curly's wife, the socioeconomic piece, the economy, the 99% and the 1%. These were kind of those canonical texts, canonical-ish texts, that kind of, I think, were reinterpreted in more interesting ways when we look at them through identity. And I think this sort of mixing kind of pieces from different periods, different pieces from pop culture, different pieces of text, work to make kind of a rich environment for discussion. And I found that those discussions really started to drive the class. And this was a class that I had trouble with in terms of management a little bit. It was kind of a really intense group. And I found that when we got into these rich, sometimes heated, sometimes uncomfortable discussions, I noticed sort of a change in the environment. The second event that I'm going to talk a little bit about was a unit a little bit later where we talked about, it was towards the end of the year, and we were writing about childhood and teenage dreams and what are the dreams like that we have as children versus what are the dreams that we have as teenagers. And we started there, how kind of when we're kids we have these sort of grandiose, sometimes stereotypical dreams. And then as teenagers, a lot of my students were talking about how their dreams kind of became simpler. I remember a lot of kids saying, my dreams are simpler now, I want more simple things. And that kind of emerged then into what are you willing to do to achieve them. And at that point we were looking at Macbeth, and we were exploring the text of Macbeth and thinking about what is Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, what are they willing to do to get what they want? And ultimately, watching different versions of the film, we explored power through media and TED Talks. Students really talked a lot about Lady Macbeth and how come everyone's labeling her as not a nice woman when Macbeth's doing pretty much everything else that she's doing, except she's kind of like smart about it. She kind of has like her master plan. And I thought, I never thought about it that way, because everyone's always like, she's such an evil, I mean, she's like the iconic evil person in Shakespeare. And my kids were kind of like, she's smart, she's ordering him around to do everything. And it was kind of like this moment that was really, I thought, powerful. They were reading her in a different way than I kind of thought about. And there was a moment I have in the class where students started talking about two pieces of hip hop. One song was Meek Mill's Tony Story. I don't think I was familiar with it, but it's a story about kind of a rise to power and what someone's willing to do to achieve power. And that song kind of became this parallel text that we used to explore Macbeth. And a couple of my young female students brought in Lupe Fiasco's Bad Bitch song about women and how we are taught to be a woman, and how the media influences how we are as women sometimes, and sometimes we fight against this, and the complexity of how women are positioned. And that song sort of became this parallel story to examine Lady Macbeth's experience. Those two songs I wasn't familiar with, And some of the content in the stories, or the songs would probably be considered, you know, might be a little, edgy. Thank you, Candace. I like edgy. But it was another time where I felt when you let go of the reins a little bit there, and students are much more savvy and intelligent and creative than I can usually ever be on a given day. It was a much more dynamic environment. And I think I've been reading Mark Lamont Hill's Hip Hop Based Education. It's this great book that just came out from Teacher College Press. And in that book, he talks a lot about looking at hip hop, not just to bring hip hop songs in, but kind of the spirit of hip hop in the English classroom. And I thought a lot about this idea of sampling in hip hop and how you take how in hip hop you take different pieces and make these like amazing songs and reinterpret things. And I kind of, in retrospect, am looking at the English classroom and kind of looking at what I was trying to do in English 11 and this idea of sampling, bringing in all these different pieces and trying to make sense of them together with the kids. This notion of cultural sampling I think is really interesting. I think has a lot of potential for us as English teachers, especially when the kids are making those choices, the students are able to make choices. Some of the findings from this, and there's much more to the research, but I won't stay here for 5 hours telling you about it, but you can talk to me anytime. Students crave authentic intellectual engagement and exploration of identity. I did a bunch of interviews, and in previous interviews for other projects I've done, this quote pretty much comes up in every interview I've ever done. Why do we only get to talk about real things in English? There's a real question about that. Why is it that English class seems to be so different? I think that's kind of what's cool about what we do. It's kind of special and beautiful and important, but it's also kind of sad. And I think we need to think about that. And for that, people often are quick to label teenagers as disconnected and uninterested. We need to think about the authentic intellectual engagement that they crave and how can we make that happen. This study kind of taught me a lot about students having a voice in one's own education. And I thought a lot about how in my own classroom, how often do kids get to really make choices? And when I started, I remember writing down how many pieces students brought in and how many decisions they got to. And initially there weren't many. And I think we need to really think about that. How much choice are we giving students? And how can we empower them to have more choice? I also thought a lot, I'm thinking a lot about critical literacy and academic skill development. And that's kind of how I started this presentation. How can we start breaking down that separation that social justice education is over here and academic skill teaching is over here? How can we merge them? And also, discussion is truly a tool to develop writing and reading, especially for students who need support. One of the things that my co-teacher often used to say, collectively you are so powerful, and I saw in these videos over and over that I had taped in my classroom of my co-teacher talking about the strategy of when you're going to write, because a lot of our students had a lot of trouble writing. Think about what Chad said, think about what Matt said, think about what Leah said, and that'll help you get writing. And discussion really became a tool to support writing. And I found for my inclusion classroom, it was probably one of the most, I think, transformative support tools that we had, really thinking about the people in the classroom and how they enhance our own thinking. And also, students need to be engaged to learn things. That wasn't said that eloquently, but it seems to often be forgotten. To truly learn something, think about any learning experience in your life. The real things that matter, you wanted to be there, you were interested, you were engaged. And I think that we kind of sideline that a lot. This is hard work full of complicated decisions and planning. I still wish I could have this year again and bring in different texts and explore things. When things got sometimes heated, I think I sometimes backed off out of fear of kind of the unknown. And I think when students aren't used to talking about things or don't have a chance to talk about things, it can get very explosive very quickly. So how do we kind of navigate that? How do we plan for that and help kind of make these decisions that can be very complicated? Also, I find it challenging to strike a balance between instructional strategies. My students in my inclusion class love to discuss, but sometimes the discussions were so rich and exciting, the writing part was like, oh, come on, really? So how do we kind of balance all of this? And the last thing I really started thinking about was how exploring gender can still be explosive and continues to be absent from much of secondary instructional pedagogy. I sort of, even as a woman, 34 years old, I kind of in my head, I know the glass ceiling is not broken, but I feel like a lot of us kind of think it's all good now, that we've sort of moved on from talking about gender. And what I found year after year, is that talking about gender almost can be one of the most explosive conversations you can have in a classroom. I found even more so sometimes than when we talk about socioeconomics and race. When we were talking about Lady Macbeth, the fighting, the complicated arguing about was she really evil or was she like brilliant, and how does that relate to kind of how often even Hillary Clinton was positioned during her campaigns, and how did we kind of talked about how Hillary Clinton was sort of Lady Macbeth during her campaign, and what does that really mean? And I found that it became very heated very quickly in an unexpected way, and it made me think a lot about how unearthed gender is in classrooms, how I think this neutralized pedagogy that seems to exist in Common Core learning standards, I think we don't bring in issues of race, class, gender, socioeconomics, ability, everything that Adrian was talking about. It's not talked about enough. And so when we're not doing that in high school classrooms, what are we losing there? Some of the questions that I'm not sure how much time we have, but these are sort of the questions that are kicking around my brain right now. How do we support new teachers in working with this framework? Critical literacy is something that I find very exciting and invigorating, but very challenging. And when working with new teachers, how do we support them to work within this framework? Also, in the world of reform and scripted module lessons are something that my district are taking up. How do we best advocate for critical literacy learning? Looking at those modules, as Jim mentioned at the beginning of our talk, there is very little talk of anything remotely connected to critical literacy. So how can we advocate for that? And what do you do when a standards movement does not include that? And also, how do we best navigate the complexities of gender study in high school English spaces that, places that might not talk about that anywhere else during their 8 hours of school every day. I have an exciting metaphor that I was going to use that I was really pumped up about, but I don't have Wi-Fi, so I'm not going to do that. But I'll post this maybe on the Willa Facebook page. And there's an artist named Chris Jordan, and I have like this really cool metaphor, so go to the Willa page, and I will explain it and post it. So I'm going to stop there.